Hello and greetings one more time from Chamonix, France. Welcome to another special UTMB episode of the Weekly Rundown. My name is Billy Yang, joined as always by my partner, Mario Fraioli. And today we welcome my mic partner, Jason Koop. How are you, buddy?
I'm very good.
All right. We needed to hear that. All right, let's get right into it. What the hell, you guys? What the hell?
What day is it? What's my name?
Sunday. Yeah.
Where are we?
Nothing about like how extremely exhausted we are, but what about the race? Not as crazy as last year, but it certainly wasn't without its carnage. It was still epic. What are just like some of your initial thoughts on what happened? Depends how
you want to define crazy. I think it was right up there with some of the craziness of last year, certainly on the American side. And I know we'll get into that discussion a little later in the episode. But I mean, it was kind of classic UTMB. I think. I mean, there were some surprising performances. There were some predictable ones, and at the end of the day, I think the best man and the best woman won the race, especially given the way that they executed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one thing that we can all take away from this, and Mario, you and I were talking about this in the wee hours of the morning, is how hard it is to get these fields to show up.
Right.
You know, as a race director, you invite 30 or 50 people on each side into the race, and you have no expectations that they're all going to show up. And out of that 30 to 50 people, a third of them will drop out beforehand. A third of them will get sick or injured or something like that, like as the week of the race draws near. And out of that third that's left, maybe a third of those people end up having a reasonable race. And so you can very easily see how an invited field of 30 or 50 people really gets whittled down to 10 or 5 very, very quickly. And this race over the last few years, because they've been inviting more and more elite athletes, is just a great example of that. It is really hard to, as a race director, for these race directors, to put together what at the end of the day will be a reasonable field. And I also think that the fact that the TDS and the CCC are so competitive,
right?
That actually hurts the UTMB at the end of the day, because there's only so many people to go around.
And I think that was one of the biggest things this year. The TDS was a super competitive race. The OCC was a crazy competitive race, and that hasn't really been the case in the last several years. CCC obviously was as well. So the overall depth of the event and distributing those elite athletes over 1, 2, 3, I guess that'd be 4 races now, is pretty unique. And to Koop's point, like just trying to get them all on the start line is a challenge in itself. And then just the nature of ultra running, and especially this event, given how difficult the course is and how things can change over the course of 105 miles, it's just really fickle. We talked about that again in the wee hours of the morning as our respective athletes dealt with their own challenges. It's just like it's so fickle, and it can change so quickly, and that can be, I mean, this year it wasn't really weather related, but that can be due to a fall on the trail, that can be due to illness that doesn't really manifest itself until later on in the race. So it's just, I mean, there was that. You couldn't predict it beforehand, but you knew something like that was bound to happen just based on history here.
You know what I'm going to do? Let's discuss this in the order that Jason Koop tweeted out this morning.
I've yet to see. I think I saw Jason's tweet.
Okay, so his first tweet was after a decent night's sleep. Good for you. Way to rub it in. I only got about 4. Here are my takeaways from this year's UTMB, CCC, TDS races, although, of course, we'll primarily focus on UTMB. 1, to win, sometimes one needs to be reasonably bold. See Pal Capel.
Yes.
1B, other times, in order to win, one just needs to grind it out. See Courtney Dauwalter.
Let me opine on that really quick.
Go for it.
So Pal winning the men's race and Courtney winning the women's race is a clear contrast in the way that you can win an ultra marathon. Powell put on a master class from the very beginning. A clinic. And
led the entire way.
Led the entire way. And we always, and for decades, we've been saying, oh, the rabbit, never wins the race. This person's going to go out too hard and they're going to blow up. Mark my words, right now, that win that he executed yesterday is going to change the way that people approach this race. And if anything, it will encourage more risk taking. Now, whether you think that's good or exciting or bad or good for this person, that's another question, right? But I think undoubtedly, because he could lead wire to wire, and for a lot of time, maybe 16 or 17 hours or something like that, the lead that he built was the lead that he maintained. And so you could very easily look at that as from Xavier's perspective and say, well, I could have run that first section faster, but I never did. Right. And that changes the dynamic of the race. Courtney, on the other hand, and I love Courtney. I live in Colorado. Courtney and I see each other a lot. I do not coach Courtney, but I have the utmost respect for her. She looked terrible all day.
Yeah.
From the get-go. She came in on limited training, hurt herself at Western States, took some downtime, I saw her just a couple of weeks before this when she was pacing one of her friends at the Ute. And I talked to her and her husband about her training, and I'm actually quite surprised she could put herself into a position to win this race. But clearly, and I think if you go back and you look at the highlights of the race, and if you're watching the race online like we were all day, it was clear that she was struggling from the get-go, but never stopped in classic Courtney style, always persevered until she can't anymore, and she just happened to be able to get to the finish line. But Courtney, I love you, but she's really lucky that the UTMB women were not very good. Across the board, that was not a very good race. That was not a competitive race at all. And I honestly think it needs to get better. So, but my original point with the way that some of these athletes can win races in completely contrasting styles, I think is really, really cool. I think that's a neat element of just the way the whole thing unfolded.
If I could jump in on that, speaking to Powell's race specifically, what it reminded me of, and I come from obviously a competitive marathon background, it was the Sammy Wanjiru equivalent of ultra marathons. The way Sammy Wanjiru won the Olympic marathon in Beijing 2008, pushing the pace from the front the entire way, throwing in surges in an event that typically is sit for 20 miles and then race the last 10K. That was very much what Powell did. He went out from the beginning, set a hard, aggressive pace. Everyone in that field took him seriously. He's got the ultra marathon resume to back it up. But myself included, and anyone who's observing is watching that, and you're like, it's a long way to lead by yourself on this course for 20 miles. Of course he's going to unravel. He never did. And that is that's going to be, mark my words, that will be a watershed moment for the sport. And to Koop's point, I think that's not that that's how every race is going to be won and run from now on. There are a million ways to do it, but you're going to see top athletes, and you've written about this, Koop, in the past. It's just like people are going to be racing the entire way. People are going to be aggressive from the get-go, and you're going to have to start making those critical decisions a lot earlier in races if you're trying to win than you would have had to in years past.
I love the Sammy Wanjiru reference, by the way. He's one of my favorite distance runners of all time.
Change the game, change the way marathons run. I mean, that after that race, I mean, he won in an Olympic record, still an Olympic record, 2:06:32 or something like that.
On a pretty,
in Beijing, China,
day.
in August. It was blazing hot and humid. I mean, it was just like crazy town. And it was after that we started seeing marathon times dropping, and just not even just the times dropping, the way people were racing marathons. They were racing from the beginning. If there weren't pacers involved, and even if there were, they were on a faster pace. But whatever, it was a watershed moment for marathoning, and I think this was a similar and is going to stand as a similar moment in trail ultra running.
Yeah, and somebody, as we all know,
similar stage
loves
too.
to race like this. Zach Miller, we talked about it last night, and he lamented a little bit about how he regrets, I know he wasn't set up to race like this, but he does lament that he didn't try to take it out in his typical fashion. He says that's his preferred style of racing.
No comment.
Oh, I thought you were going to transition to something from
no
there.
comment.
I guess not.
Well, I moved the mic for a reason, in case somebody had follow-up thoughts. Okay. Number 2, everyone has bad days. Sometimes a lot of people have bad days all at once. This year, a lot of good runners had bad days all at once. So to their
For
credit,
the second year in a row.
the women's field, we did talk about the depth of the women's field and the competition. Maybe less top-heavy than the men's side, but there was depth there. And this contributed to some of the not as competitive on the top of the field as they probably could have been. 2B, the heart of the race, the more number 2 is exacerbated. And then 2C, this can make some races very good and exciting and others not so much. Love your takes, by the way.
I think I'll let Koop just expound upon that first, and then I can offer some
I go
commentary.
back to my original point, and once again, I don't care about the hate mail I get. I'm just trying to be real. The women's race was terrible. I mean, 4 hours between the first and the 10th women, between the first woman and the 10th woman. That's not good competition. That's not good depth of competition. That's not good for the sport. And it's not, I think the really unfortunate thing is it's not representative of how good all of the women who showed up actually are.
Right.
And going back to my earlier point that it's hard to get these fields to unfold, the fact that UTMB is so hard, it's a night start, you've got a lot of people coming in, time zone difference, and it's a hard race and all these other things. That compounds this attrition that we see during the race itself, and very unfortunately so, it unfolds into kind of boring races. Now there are interesting storylines in between that, right? Courtney not having a good day and still persevering, and there were other women out there that had surprising performances, but when you've got these huge time gaps between first and second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth and ninth and 10th, we just have to do better. I think for the health of the sport, especially in the really big races, they can't all be runaway races. Now you look at, the men's side, which was, I think it was reasonably entertaining all day. Like just seeing if and when Powell is going to blow up, is something going to happen?
And some of Xavier's caliber chasing him.
Exactly. You've got the French hero. He's won every race here. He's the returning champion. He's kind of hunting him down all day. And then you've got this guy who one of my athletes, right, beat in a very similar setup. Right, Powell was out all day. Ultra Tour Mount Fuji. Dylan took over the race in the last 5 kilometers.
Powell had 27 minutes on him at 100K or something like that.
I mean, it was almost the exact same setup except for the result. But certain glimmers of the men's race that paralleled the women's race is there was just a lot of attrition. I mean, you just look across the board and people are dropping out. The Americans in particular were terrible, right? I think that we, as Americans, as homers, right? We're all homers here for a large part.
If you listen to the preview show, that is a true statement, and I'm going to take some of that back here in a little bit.
Yeah. So, but anyway, like I said, the men's race was reasonably exciting because you had this first second dynamic. But it still had shades of the women's race where there was just a lot of attrition.
And to that point in the women's race, I felt like from the beginning, I mean, there were a lot of interesting storylines in there, and we talked about people to watch who could potentially finish in the top 10. But for the win, it was like all eyes were on Courtney because of her dominance over the last several years, and people wanted to see, has she recovered from the injury at Western States? And then, I mean, Miao Yao was a talk of the town beforehand because she won CCC here last year, led the entire way. We knew she was going to go out hard, and she did. Dylan Bowman called it to a T, and she ended up dropping out. And it was like people were watching those two women, and if it wasn't that, I mean, there was no one else that was ever really in the race for the win. And, so it's like, not that it was boring, but it kind of was from that standpoint. And, on the men's side, similar to last year. And again, we were talking about, this is the year. If there's a year that an American male is going to win, it's going to be this year. We're bringing all of our best. Some of them have had good success here. And I mean, even one of my athletes, Tim Tollefson, who unfortunately for the second year in a row had to withdraw this year due to a potential virus, we think, based on how he was feeling. But it's like Tim dropped, Zach eventually had to drop, Alex Nichols, and all these guys, like at some point, early on looked like, oh, this could be it. Like, this could be it. They were all up there in the front. And then Andrew Miller came up, someone who we hadn't really talked about much before the race. Eventually he dropped as well. Hayden Hawks dropped. So it's just like, there's like 4 or 5 guys who could potentially have been in the mix for the race who are out of it by halfway. If not beyond that, and then all of a sudden it's a different ball game, at that point, because there are just other people who ended up finishing in the top 10 who, let's be honest, otherwise wouldn't have been there.
Is this just a trend that we're going to see year after year? I mean, this is clearly, and I do want to underscore that I think both fields were set up for it to be a potentially really entertaining race, and I still really enjoyed seeing the women's side, whether or not Courtney could hang on, because to Koop's point, she did not look like Courtney of old, where she's smiling, energetic, cheerful. She looked like she was in the pain cave for a long, long time.
Grounded out all day.
So I'm just really, to not be a homer too much, but let's talk about it. I think one of the main takeaways or the headlines from this past weekend was, for the lack of a better term, of the failure of Americans, specifically the American men. And on the women's side, there was Corinne Malcolm and a couple of other women who also went through the same thing. So since I have 2 coaches, and a lot of running 100 miles is the stomach and how you maintain that. We can't just attribute it to some mystery virus, right? I mean, does it come part and parcel to racing a certain style and possibly going out too hard? Or I'm really curious about the alchemy of like what it takes for someone's body to start shutting down.
I mean, I think there's certainly a myriad of factors that contribute to it. I mean, this year, I can speak to Tim because I coach him and I've spoken to him since the race, but he said he felt off from the get-go. He was sweating heavily early on, actually changed his shirt at Lake Contamine and just felt off all day and just knew like he couldn't continue. And, I think it was a virus, but, and that's not to make an excuse, but it's like, there's not much you can do in a situation like that. I do think, like, to Koop's point earlier, like with the night start and like a lot of that stuff, yeah, that can throw off your nutrition, but you should practice that, beforehand and know like what you have to do all day so that your stomach's not a mess at 6 p.m., when you start, or based on the conditions, like how you're going to handle, different parts of it. I mean, and yeah, I'm sure there were maybe some people who just went out, thinking they could do something that they weren't ready for. And if you try that here and you're not ready for it, the race is going to expose you, and it's going to spit you out the back end. So, and who knows, and maybe Americans, to some degree on the men's side especially, have gotten a little too cocky based on, how well some of us did here in like 2015, 16, 17 or so. And the last 2 years will serve as a bit of a wake-up call to make the adjustments that need to be made so that they can have successful days here again. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think Koop will have a better take on it than I do.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if we back up like 30,000 feet, right? Like, I think it's an all of the above thing. And before anybody, starts getting all riled up that Mario and I are just sitting here on our high horses, I think both of us would say that it's us too.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's the network of coaches and people that are giving advice that also need to do a better job to get athletes in a position to do well at this race.
It's the first question you ask yourself.
Right. What could I have done?
What could I have done better for my athletes? Why didn't they have the success that we had trained for?
Yep, 100%. And maybe it's just that's just the way the dice were going to roll the last couple of years. That it just seems like 2 steps back, right? But maybe the coaches and the athletes need to take a hard look at, hey, what are we doing? Do we really want to make this a priority? How are we going to make it a priority? What things are we going to do different? My take is always when you have a kind of a consistent source of not having success. I was going to say failure, but I tried to spin it into a positive. But when you have a consistent source of not having success, so that consistent source in this case is the men at UTMB. And it is consistent. This race has been around long enough that we as Americans should have more success here. I do think that when you have that consistency and you want to change it, you have to take a hard look at everything that you're doing. And everything means just that. It means the training, it means the preparation, how you set your season up, how you approach it, the attitude that you carry into it. For whatever reason, everybody getting sick, there's no reason for that. Because so I live in Colorado Springs, so I use this a lot because I have a lot of colleagues over at the Olympic Training Center. They have procedures and protocols in place for when those teams go out and travel, not just the running teams, but all the teams, when they go out and travel to try to prevent sickness. I don't think any of those athletes follow a lot of those best practices here. But my takeaway, Billy, is if the Americans want to succeed here, and they do,
And they have.
and they have. But if we want to put an American at the top step of the podium here, I think that it's worth everybody's while to look at that whole ecosystem for how that can actually happen. The whole ecosystem of travel, training, preparation, course knowledge, on course support, the whole kind of kit and caboodle. Because you look at Spain, who had a great weekend, right? Had a great weekend across the board. There's no, I would put my last Euro on there's some type of coordination that those athletes from that very small country have had. And whether it's informal, like we always have informal discussions, and athletes have informal discussions like that, or formal, who knows. But I think that the success that country in particular had across these races is not just a complete coincidence
sure.
or fluke.
I think a lot of it too, not to pin it down to any of those one elements, I'm with you. It's all of it to some degree. What I've noticed in being here 2 years now, Tim's raced here 5 years in a row, so I've had discussions with him about this. The week of the race for the top athletes, things have changed quite a bit in terms of kind of commitments, hype in town, and that's part of that whole coordination and the travel thing. And I do think it can have, you can ruin your race in that last week if your mind is occupied, or if you've come out here a couple weeks early and you've kind of like blown it, traveling around to all these different places, seeing as much of the course, as possible. Like, to me, those types of things show a lack of confidence in yourself and in your preparation. It's kind of hitting the panic button of sort. It's like, I'm here, I'm going to go see the whole course for like a week before the race. And then the week of, like, I'm just going to enjoy the entire atmosphere. And it's like, yeah, enjoy it to a certain degree. But it's like, if you're one of those top athletes, you're thinking about this differently than the other 2,000 people behind you, and you have to dial in those details better. That is part of your job. And I'm not naming any names at all, but I've just seen from observing from afar and then actually being here, for the last week, you kind of shake your head a bit as far as like what's going on, because it's overwhelming, and it's just too much. And it's, I think you remarked on it, Billy, too, like just the scene itself, like, every year it's like everything's getting magnified and amplified, I should say. The amount of people, the amount of expectations, the amount of commitments and all of that. And it does become overwhelming when you've built your whole year around this.
I had an athlete, true story, an athlete that raced one of the races. I'm going to try to make this as anonymous as I can. And that athlete had 7 events for their primary sponsor, 7 events since they got here. That is unreasonable. And I told this athlete that, and fortunately that story ended up quite well. The athlete that I'm talking about did rather well in the race, but it's too much. And I get it from a brand perspective, you want to leverage everybody being at the same place and the same time, and you got to, you know, get the advertising value out of your athletes and all those other things. But at the same time, you have an athlete at the top step of the podium. That's pretty darn valuable too. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, a biased perspective, I would argue a way more valuable marketing tool than sending an athlete to another speaking engagement or another signing event or another group run or another talk or another this or another that. It's too much. So brand managers, back off a little bit, because your athletes are getting affected. I'm telling you guys this as a coach. I tell my athletes this in private when they have to set these weeks up. But it's too much. You got to have a balance. And that's one, though. That's one. That's not everything.
No, it's not everything.
We can't put everything on that thing. I think I described it as an ecosystem. I do think that there's a lot of things that all of the Americans can look at. Maybe we can do a whole podcast on that could lead to better success across this event, particularly for the men, because Courtney kicked ass.
Yeah, because we're speaking for the men, and American women here have kicked ass historically, and even here, I think we had 3 in the top 10. We had Courtney, Katie Scheid, and then Rory Bozio, 3 in the top 10. I mean, that's solid. And Rory's had obviously great success here. Courtney's had great success pretty much wherever she's ran. And, you know, Katie Scheid doesn't get the credit she deserves because she's not in the U.S. and she's, you know, training here, and she's easy to forget about, I think, from that standpoint. But, yeah, I mean, the women have been doing it right here for a while. But on the men's side, I think we as coaches, as athletes, as brands can do a better job, as Koop said, coordinating all of that. So collectively, we can have a better chance of success on what is arguably the world's biggest stage in trail ultra running.
Any other headlines or maybe not so obvious stories that jump out at you from this past weekend?
I think we talked a little bit about it earlier, but this isn't specific just to the UTMB part of this event, but this event as a competitive event as a whole. They're all getting more competitive, and it'll be interesting to see what that means for the UTMB in coming years, and sort of what that means for, you know, ultra running in general. I mean, I think it's a good thing to see the sport growing and to see more events and more opportunities. On the flip side, it's going to water things down quite a bit, and it's going to set up situations where the top athletes aren't always competing against one another. I mean, we've, you know, seen a little bit of it here. This year we had some top people in the TDS who weren't in the UTMB and vice versa, and it's like, which one's going to be like the event? And a lot of them, like between the CCC, TDS, and, you know, UTMB, they're all, you know, pretty similar in terms of their long races, their difficult courses. I mean, TDS is probably a little bit more difficult, but it's like, which one do we place the most importance of? Do we need to? But then, you know, outside of just this week and this event, as more events pop up and more money comes in the sport, more brands want to get behind them, and events want to bring, you know, athletes in. I mean, you can only race so many long races like this in a year and have it be fruitful. But it'll be interesting to see, to the first point Koop made, is like, you know, you can get 30 people to a start line, and we've seen even with that, like, it ends up being a handful of them who are actually competing against one another. And now you spread that over the course of more events throughout the year. I'm curious to see what it does to the UTMB, the 105-mile circumnavigation of the mountain, but also to like the bigger events in ultra running in general.
So I have a couple like takeaways aside from that. First off, CCC, TDS, great racing across the board. Mm-hmm. Really exciting to watch. I was out there on both of those courses all day, seeing athletes come into aid stations together, you know, 50K, 80K into those races. It's really neat, and that's good for the sport. And the athletes competed. That's really, really cool to see when you have an athlete that's been out there for, you know, 80 kilometers, 100 kilometers, and they're still having to like put their head down and compete, not just put their head down and go forward, but put their head down and compete, because the woman behind them, you know, they can see their headlamp, or they're in the aid station together or whatever. That's awesome. And I think that is absolutely good for the sport.
And the depth in those races, to your point about the UTMB earlier, especially on the women's side with the difference between first and 10th, was much better in the finished results.
Yep. It was great. And then the second thing is, every year this race has gotten, the races here have gotten a little bit better with the way that they cover it. And it is awesome. Mm-hmm. It is awesome. I love what Brian and Megan do with their Twitter feeds. We've got to evolve past that. We've got to evolve past 200 character tweets that everybody's looking at around the world to cover these races, because they're in beautiful landscapes. They're magnificent. The athletes always have great storylines. They can be exciting, especially at the high levels. We talked about some of the challenges with that, but that didn't happen overnight. All of the camera crews out there, and I think they had equal teams following the men and the women, which kudos to UTMB for doing that. That is freaking great. Something that they got called out last year. I called them out last year on that, and that they rightfully fixed. But it didn't happen overnight. They didn't put together that whole studio that you see at the Majestic and all the teams of people with GoPros and mountain bikes and you have to get really great runners to be able to run with the great runners that are out there. That doesn't happen in one fell swoop. It's been incremental progress where every year for maybe about the past 5 or 6 years, their broadcast team has just kind of gradually stepped up. And once again, that's something that's good for the sport as well, because it makes it accessible for, especially an American audience, to be able to follow something like that online. Like, how many people can see live in any trail race the top men and women like literally duking it out? You don't see that anywhere, but yet I'm on the side of the road in Italy and in France and in Switzerland with my silly little smartphone, watching what's going on and going, this is super entertaining. I want to buy every product, every banner that's around there, but I just love watching the races there. So that takeaway for me was just like really cool to see that evolution kind of unfold the last few years.
Well, and what that does for the excitement around the sport in general, I've seen it when I do pop into my Twitter feed or you look on Instagram. You've got people who for the rest of the year pay little to no interest in ultra running, either tweeting at me or friends of mine texting me saying, I'm watching this coverage and it is like, I want to go run around a mountain in France right now. Or maybe I don't want to go that, but I want to go experience that because it looks really cool. I saw Fast Women, which is a great newsletter Allison Wade puts out every week covering women's running across domains. She's very comprehensive. She had a tweet out this morning. She's like, I think more races need dramatic start line music and knock down like barriers for the fans, because you saw Pau Capel and he's when he's finishing, and like they did a good job like highlighting that, and it's like I think that captures like the excitement around this event and makes it appealing, and it's gotten better and better every year. And I do think like something like Twitter also plays a role. I mean, that's not an official broadcast partner of the race, but it is an easy it's an easy and an effective way for people to follow it who can't actually be watching the entire thing or tracking the live results the entire time. So I think it's like, it's a big, ecosystem, but the race itself and the way they broadcast it, it's great for this race. But I think if other races kind of take a cue from that and can, obviously this race has numbers. There's thousands of people running it. There's tons of corporate sponsors that make this possible. It doesn't happen for free. And not every other race is going to have that. But I think every race can do a little bit better than they're probably doing now. And that's only going to help the sport as a whole.
Yeah, two things on that. By the way, two things on that. Yeah. The money thing, as you mentioned, is huge. I do think they have set the model for what it can be, but Europe, UTMB week in particular, is trail running on steroids. And 2,500 participants is just not a possibility on most public lands in the States. So
pretty much every public land in the States.
Yeah. And also what they have going for them is exclusivity. And what I mean by that is that there are brands who pay in the tens of thousands of dollars for media credentials, and yet every year their access gets more and more limited. And it is beyond frustrating. As somebody who's covered this event in some capacity since 2015 every year on, while the live coverage has gotten steadily better, the access has gotten steadily worse with more restrictions placed on it. And if this were to happen back in the States, the outrage, the level of outrage and the pushback would be, would prevent for something like this to happen. It just would. So I think, UTMB, I guess to their credit or discredit, has really owned how the media or how the media coverage gets sent out. And I think, again, amazing to follow online. But if you start to unpack all the elements that went into it, it's just a hard thing to replicate. It just is.
Yeah. I was having this conversation with Tim Tolfson this morning before I went out and ran and came here. But here's what I think is going to happen. Here's what it reminds me of. UTMB is trying to be the Iron Man of ultra running. Yeah, they're building that brand, the UTMB brand. I mean, that stands for Ultra Tour de Mont Blanc, but now they have UTMB Oman, they have UTMB and they're adding. They want to expand into the U.S. They want to expand into bigger markets. This race here, the UTMB Mont Blanc, is trying to be the Kona of ultra running. Like, this is the Super Bowl. It's going to get the biggest hype, the most attention, the way people qualify for it. And that is going to trickle down to, the sponsorship level, the media. They want to own it. They want to own that brand. They want this to be like the brand that people think of when they think of ultra running. And there's some benefits to that because there's a lot of money there. The coverage side of it, more exposure for the sport, gets people into it. The downside of that is it could potentially hurt a lot of, especially in the States, like these smaller events, grassroots events. They're not going to all go away, but they're going to be impacted because new people who get into the sport aren't going to realize like the importance of those grassroots events. And, it's going to be all about UTMB. So that worries me a little bit. And even, talk about Ironman as an organization and Wanda, they're buying up races as well because they want to compete with this UTMB brand because the sport, is growing. So there's a lot of exciting things happening, but greed worries me. Big corporations worry me a little bit. And I just hope that the people in power don't make decisions that are ultimately going to hurt the spirit of the sport. Anyway, little rant, side tangent, but I was thinking about that this morning as I was thinking about this event as a whole.
I'm just reminded of the fact that I'm sandwiched in between two media people, right? And I have no media savvy at all, so maybe I should take a cue from you guys. But I can tell you that if I put my fan hat on, right, not my coaching hat on or whatever, it's exciting as shit to watch. Sorry for the cuss words, but it really is exciting to watch. And I've always taken the perspective that the more excitement you can create and the more people that you can bring underneath the tent, the healthier that sport and or that activity is. And I get that there's going to be frustrations, right? Frustrations with some of the media, frustrations with this, frustrations with that. But right now, it's not close. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. It's not. The fact that we watch a Twitter feed for Western states,
and that's the only way the race is covered.
A text-based Twitter feed for the race at Western States, which is the most hyped 100-mile race in the U.S. And you compare and contrast it with the last couple days, that's like Mars and Venus, you guys. I mean, come on, it's just so different. So I'm not saying that the U.S. has to replicate the 60-person army that's down there right now. But we got to take small incremental steps so it's not just the friggin', ultra nerds that are paying attention to it. I mean, you and I were talking last night about some of the really marquee runners that are paying attention to this. And a lot of the reason they're paying attention to it is because it's actually exciting and accessible to watch, and there's video and not text and all those other things. So anyway, I just take the approach of, here's a blueprint. We don't have to scale it all the way up.
But there are elements you can take. Yep, I agree. I think there are definitely lessons that can be taken from this in the U.S. specifically, where the sport is still very small. I mean, it's a big deal over here. It's a legit professional sport from every which angle, and we want to get there in the U.S., and I think we should try and get there in the U.S. There's going to be limitations on field sizes and what you can do on public land and blah, blah, blah. But, from a coverage standpoint, we can do a lot better. I mean, to be able to cover a 105-mile race around the mountain and follow the leaders the entire way is like, okay, if you can do that, why can't you do it somewhere else?
My final point to that is that, it does give me some hope and promise that trail and ultra running, maybe mountain running in particular, can be a featured event in the Olympics moving forward, because I think there's a way to display that in an exciting, interesting way, especially if there's context in the way of storylines and whatnot. So the remaining tweets are kind of part and parcel to what we had already discussed. I think the last point or the last thing that we want to maybe unpack and talk about could be the future. And Koop's final tweet was about reducing unforced errors. Don't pile a bad stomach onto bad pacing onto a bad attitude. There are many runners kicking themselves today on this one. So we discussed it somewhat. I do think that, a little more specifically as coaches, what will your takeaways be in how you train and counsel your athletes moving forward to have success at this race in future years?
I mean, for me, my experience in that regard is much more limited than Koop's as far as the number of athletes that I've actually had competing here. And I'm fortunate in that one of those athletes who's done well here, Tim Tollefson, he lives in a place, Mammoth Lakes, where you can actually replicate this terrain pretty well, probably better than any place in the U.S. And it's that specificity of training. So for someone like him, it's easy because it's his backyard and he doesn't have to go anywhere and he works a full-time job. For my other athletes who have raced here, it's like finding ways to do a better job of replicating the specific demands of this race, so that it is not a total shock when they get here as far as what they're in for and the demands that places on their body. And all the things we've already talked about, from like, okay, being ready for the night start and what you have to do during the day to manage that, and like how you're dealing with specific situations, throughout the race. But I think the biggest thing for me, especially for my more top level athletes, is managing the week of the race and the weeks before the race, because we can prepare perfectly for it. And because of non-training errors or even tactical errors during the race, ruin it before it even starts. So I think for me, that's something I'll be paying a lot more attention to, moving forward. And then just, what was reinforced to me last year and this year is, these things are pretty unpredictable, and a lot of different things that can come up that could potentially derail your race, but you can work through probably 90% of them, 95% of them, and just like preparing for, like, having all those sort of like contingency plans when things don't exactly go, according to plan, and making sure that we're addressing, those sorts of things, in training, and for the more competitive athletes, just reminding them like, hey, the game's changed now. Like the way these races are being run and people are competing, like we've got to change the way, not in terms of like workouts, but just like when you step the line, like you've got to be on it from the beginning. And you're going to have to be making decisions earlier in the race, and, commitments, and like, deciding if you really do want to like compete in this thing. Like, it's not going to be, sit and kick in an ultra. It doesn't really happen, but like one of those things like where you're going to sit for most of the day and then like, okay, I'll really close hard over the final third, because the race is probably going to be away from you at that point. So, I mean, that's just, my brain's not functioning super well right now, and I'm not putting all the thoughts together, but those are sort of the biggest things that jump out to me that I've been thinking about just in the last like 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours as I was watching things unfold out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think on the elite side of things, those athletes need to, and I think they largely have, and this will obviously continue to evolve, but they need to be okay with taking a reasonable level of risk
yeah,
at multiple points during the race, not just, okay, that's my blanket statement, at multiple and strategic points during the race. So going back to your comment about Zach, it's not just about going out as hard as you can and seeing if you're going to hang on or not. It's about running smart, and within that umbrella of running smart, realizing that there is going to be an acceptable level of risk-taking. Particularly, once again, the women's race did not play out like that, right? It's slugfest, and Courtney brought the biggest hammer, right? But within a highly competitive race, what's ultimately going to end up happening is the physiological differences between the athletes just get smaller and smaller and smaller. And whenever that happens, the way that the athletes execute the race and execute the week of the race ends up making a big difference. They still, don't get me wrong, they still have to get all the fundamentals right. the 90% to get there, right? All the training, the months of it leading up, the vertical, the terrain that you mentioned, and things like that. But as it gets more competitive, that 90% starts to be pretty even. They all kind of come to the race with the same toolkit.
Yep.
And then how they unpack that toolkit and how they execute the race becomes a bigger and bigger thing. And you're going to see, this is my prediction, right? We'll see if I'm right 5 years from now. You're going to see people racing down the last descent. It's going to be, and not just two. You're going to see 4, 5, 6 people all within a few minutes of each other coming down Les Flégères. And how awesome is that going to be to see unfold, racing through the freaking streets of Chamonix? I mean, we've seen it like further back in the men's field, right? You guys remember Jim racing down the streets of Chamonix a few years ago. I think we're going to see kind of more and more of that. And anyway, back to my original point, just a big key with that is making sure that that you're just okay with an acceptable level of risk taking during the event itself, because it's a long way, right? You're not just pegging yourself the whole way. You've got to like be able to manage it for 20 some odd hours.
Great stuff, you guys. I think there's a lot more of this race that we can decipher, break down, unpack, but we have a full day, full last day ahead.
I'd love to unpack it more when my brain is functioning optimally.
All right. Well, on behalf of myself, Jason Koop, Mario Fraioli, what a weekend, what a week. Thank you for joining us for another episode, and we will see you back on the mainland, kids.